Hi guys! Tonight we're stepping quietly into the long-shadowed streets of Victorian Britain, where rainwater gathers between uneven stones, where chimney smoke drifts low above rooftops, and where an entire century is preparing to change the shape of ordinary human life without fully understanding the cost. Outside, the modern world still hums along in its restless rhythm. Screens glow. Traffic moves somewhere beyond the walls. Someone, somewhere, is still answering emails under bright kitchen lights. But here, in this slower place, the hour feels softer. The room feels quieter now. A coal fire settles with a faint crack somewhere in the distance. Wood contracts gently in the night air. You begin to notice how easy it is to follow the sound of old footsteps once the day loosens its grip a little. Britain in 1837 does not yet know the name Victorian Era. It is simply another damp June morning in London, when an 18-year-old girl is woken before dawn and told that the king is dead. She rises from bed quickly, still wrapped in the fragile confusion between sleep and responsibility. Her hair is undone. Her face still carries the softness of youth. Outside the palace windows, the early sky hangs pale and uncertain over the city. Carriages wait below in the cold morning air, horses shifting impatiently, their breath drifting white. The girl is Alexandrina Victoria. Soon she will simply become Victoria, and without really realizing it, you've already followed her into another century. So before your attention drifts fully into another century, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet nights of history with me. And if you feel like it tonight, share where you're listening from, what time it is there, and which corner of history you always find yourself returning to. There is something strangely comforting about knowing quiet listeners are scattered across the dark together, following the same old roads. Victoria has spent much of her childhood controlled by adults, watched closely, managed carefully, protected in ways that feel almost suffocating. She rarely walks alone, rarely sleeps without supervision nearby. Her mother and advisors fear scandal constantly. Royal families across Europe have learned to fear instability by now. Revolutions still linger in living memory. Even as a child, Victoria understands that freedom is a fragile thing. Now she stands inside the Kensington Palace, exhausted before the day has properly begun, listening as senior officials bow before her. One of them is the Archbishop of Canterbury, still tired from being dragged across London in the dark. Another is the Lord Chamberlain. Their clothes smell faintly of damp wool and carriage mud. She later writes that she answered them calmly, but calmness is not the same thing as comfort. The Britain she inherits is uneasy beneath its confidence. Industrial cities are expanding rapidly. Factory bells dictate entire human lives. Rivers carry chemical waste through crowded neighborhoods. Children work long hours beside dangerous machinery. Wealth accumulates astonishingly fast in certain districts while hunger settles permanently into others. And everywhere, there is coal smoke. It drifts through London streets. It settles onto curtains and lungs and bread crusts. Visitors describe the city air as thick enough to taste. By evening, soot gathers quietly on window frames like dark snow. Still, there is energy in the country too. A strange electric feeling. Britain believes itself to be advancing towards something extraordinary. Ships leave crowded ports carrying textiles, iron goods, and imperial ambition. Engineers discuss impossible bridges over dinner tables. Investors dream about railways slicing through the countryside. Newspapers spread stories faster than ever before. In crowded coffee houses, men argue about reform, empire, labour, and God while spoons tap gently against porcelain cups. History feels close enough to touch. Victoria herself remains uncertain at first. She is small, barely over 5 feet tall. Her voice is high and quick when nervous. Some politicians assume they can control her easily, One elderly statesman reportedly dismisses her as a child. They underestimate her almost immediately. You can imagine the strange loneliness of it. To become queen before fully becoming yourself, to sit beneath candlelight while experienced men, twice your age, wait for instructions, to sign papers that alter thousands of lives while still learning how your own mind works. After a while, the palace begins to settle around her routine. Red boxes of government documents arrive daily. Servants move quietly through long corridors. Candles burn low beside stacks of correspondence. Outside, London continues growing louder. The city already holds over 1 million people. At night, carriage wheels scrape through mud beside expensive clubs and crowded slums alike. Street sellers shout beneath gas lamps. Sewage drifts through poorer districts. Barefoot children sleep beneath arches near markets where wealthy gentlemen purchase imported fruit. Victorian Britain often lives wall beside wall with itself like this, luxury pressing directly against misery. And yet many people sincerely believe progress will solve everything. Factories produce astonishing amounts of cloth, iron, and machinery. The expanding empire pours resources into British ports. Middle-class families begin decorating parlours with upholstered furniture, polished clocks, framed landscapes, and carefully arranged bookshelves. Domestic comfort becomes almost a moral ideal. Inside these homes, women smooth tablecloths carefully before guests arrive. Men discuss business over roast beef and tobacco smoke. Piano music drifts softly through narrow streets during evening hours. Respectability becomes its own kind of performance. But beyond the warm drawing rooms, another Britain works itself toward exhaustion. In Manchester, factory workers wake before sunrise and walk through freezing rain toward textile mills whose windows already glow orange through the dark. Machines thunder continuously inside. Cotton fibers float through the air and settle into lungs. Some workers lose fingers, some lose hearing, gradually. Some simply disappear into the endless churn of industrial labour. Children crawl beneath moving machinery because their bodies are small enough to fit. There are official investigations, reports, concerned speeches. Certain reforms slowly arrive over the decades. But industry moves faster than compassion most of the time. You begin to notice something important about the Victorian Age after sitting with it long enough. Its confidence and its cruelty often grow together. The same society building magnificent rail stations also sends children into mines. The same culture praising morality tolerates terrible urban poverty. The same empire celebrating civilization profits from violence far beyond British shores. None of this feels simple while living through it. Ordinary people still fall in love, still laugh at dinner tables, and still complain about weather and taxes and aching feet. A mother still worries when her son coughs through the night. A dock worker still pauses beside the river at dawn to watch fog move across the water. History rarely feels dramatic to the people trapped inside it. Young Queen Victoria slowly learns this too. At first, she enjoys freedom almost greedily. For the first time in her life, she chooses her own schedule. She moves her bed from her mother's room. She spends long evenings talking and laughing with trusted advisors. She rides horses through parks. She develops fierce loyalties and fierce dislikes. Sometimes she behaves impulsively, sometimes stubbornly, sometimes warmly enough to surprise hardened politicians. She is human before she becomes symbolic. Outside the palace walls, Britain keeps moving. Steam engines hiss. Newspapers rustle open beside breakfast tables. Dock bells echo through cold morning fog. Somewhere in the northern mills, another shift begins before daylight fully arrives. And overhead, spreading slowly across the darkening industrial sky, the coal smoke drifts onward into the century. Morning arrives slowly in the industrial towns, not with birdsong or soft sunlight through quiet trees, but with whistles, iron wheels, boots against wet pavement, smoke already thick in the air before dawn properly breaks across the rooftops. You walk early here, because everyone does in Manchester. Leeds, Birmingham, Sheffield, entire neighbourhoods rise together in darkness. Thin walls carry the sound of coughing from one room to another. Someone stirs ashes in a small fireplace. Someone buttons a worn shirt with stiff fingers. Somewhere downstairs, a baby cries briefly before exhaustion pulls it quiet again. The streets outside glisten with rain and soot. Factory workers move through them in steady silence, shoulders bent slightly against the cold. Women carry shawls tightly wrapped around themselves. Men walk with lunch tins under their arms. Children hurry beside parents, not because they are accompanying them, but because they are workers too. The Victorian era loves the language of progress. Newspapers praise productivity. Politicians celebrate industrial output. Wealthy businessmen describe factories almost reverently as engines of national greatness. Britain produces textiles, machinery, iron, coal, and manufactured goods on a scale the world has never seen before. But inside the mills, progress sounds different. It roars. The machines never seem fully still. Belts slap rhythmically overhead. Metal shudders. Steam hisses through pipes. Thousands of moving parts turn continuously beside human bodies that must keep pace or suffer the consequences. You can almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. Cotton mills are especially brutal. The air remains hot and damp because moisture prevents threads from snapping. Workers breathe floating fibers for hours each day. Lungs weaken gradually. Eyes sting constantly, and conversation becomes difficult above the machinery. So people communicate with gestures and tired expressions. Children work because small hands fit easily beneath dangerous equipment. Some begin labor around 8 or 9 years old. Earlier in certain places, they clean moving machines, gather loose fibers, carry materials through narrow spaces. Many survive, some do not. Victorian Britain understands this more clearly than later generations sometimes imagine. Reports exist. Journalists describe injuries. Reformers campaign publicly. Factory owners defend themselves in newspapers and parliament. There are arguments everywhere about responsibility, morality, and profit. But argument moves slowly compared to industry, and poverty leaves little room for refusal. If you stand quietly for a moment beside one of these northern streets after sunset, you begin noticing another side of industrial life too. Not only suffering, endurance. A woman scrubs coal dust from her doorstep, even though it will return tomorrow morning. Men gather briefly outside public houses, sharing jokes through exhaustion. Someone plays a fiddle in an upstairs room. Laundry hangs stubbornly between buildings beneath grey skies. People continue living because human beings always do. The homes themselves are often cramped beyond comfort. Entire families sleep in 1 or 2 rooms. Wallpaper peels from the damp walls. Water must be carried manually. Sewage systems remain unreliable or non-existent in poorer districts. The smell stays with visitors longest. Coal smoke, rotting refuse, horse manure, wet wool, river pollution drifting through crowded neighbourhoods during warmer months. Contemporary observers frequently describe industrial cities as physically overwhelming. Some compare certain districts to open wounds. Still, people arrive constantly from the countryside. That is the strange pull of the age. Factories are dangerous, but rural poverty can be worse. Mechanized agriculture changes village life. Traditional labor disappears gradually. Young men and women leave farming communities hoping for wages, independence, or simply survival. They board crowded carts and trains carrying small bundles of clothing, then step into industrial cities that feel almost impossibly loud. After a while, even the noise becomes ordinary. Your body adapts. Your ears stop resisting. You learn to sleep through distant machinery and shouting in the alley below. Human beings can normalize astonishing things. Queen Victoria herself rarely sees the worst conditions directly during these early years. Few monarchs truly witness industrial poverty firsthand. Royal life remains insulated by ceremony, distance, and careful management. But the social tensions reach the government constantly. There are strikes, demonstrations, petitions demanding political reform. Workers want representation, shorter hours, safer conditions, voting rights. The Chartist movement grows through the late 1830s and 1840s, gathering huge crowds demanding democratic change. To many wealthy Britons, this feels deeply frightening. Europe still remembers revolution vividly. France especially remains a warning, lodged permanently inside upper-class imagination. Disorder suggests chaos. Crowds suggest danger. Property owners fear that social collapse waits just beneath the surface of urban life. And sometimes the fear is not entirely irrational. Meetings become riots occasionally. Troops appear in industrial towns. Windows shatter. People die. But far more often, exhaustion simply settles over working lives like another layer of soot. Women carry especially heavy burdens. Many labour inside factories all day, then return home to cooking, washing, sewing, and childcare in overcrowded conditions. Pregnancy offers little protection from labour, neither does illness. A tired mother still needs water carried upstairs. A sick child still needs feeding. Victorian morality praises domestic womanhood constantly, but poor women rarely possess the luxury of existing only inside the home. Survival demands too much work. Even middle-class comfort depends partly upon invisible labour beneath it. Servants clean fireplaces before dawn. Seamstresses damage their eyesight stitching clothing by candlelight. Laundry workers scrub wealthy households' linens until their hands crack raw from chemicals and hot water. Behind polished Victorian respectability, someone is always exhausted, and yet the century keeps inventing beautiful things too. This contradiction never fully disappears. Railways expand rapidly across Britain during these decades. Engineers carve tunnels through hillsides and raise enormous bridges above rivers. Train stations appear like cathedrals of iron and glass. Suddenly, journeys that once required exhausting days by carriage become possible in hours. People experience distance differently almost overnight. A businessman in London can travel north faster than previous generations believed imaginable. Fresh newspapers circulate rapidly between cities. Lovers separated by geography exchange letters more easily. Seaside holidays slowly become accessible to ordinary families. For some Victorians, the future feels thrilling. For others, frightening. Older rural communities sometimes distrust railways deeply at first. Trains seem unnatural, violent. Cows panic at the noise, smoke trails across peaceful fields. Ancient rhythms begin breaking apart beneath industrial speed. Time itself feels altered before railways. Towns often keep slightly different local times based on the sun, but trains require standard schedules. Gradually, standardized railway time spreads across Britain. Clocks become instruments of industrial discipline. Minutes suddenly matter differently. You begin noticing clocks everywhere in Victorian life after this. Factory clocks and station clocks and pocket watches, school bells, timetables pinned beside railway platforms. The century grows increasingly obsessed with measuring human movement precisely. And beneath all this motion sits Queen Victoria herself, still young, still learning how to inhabit power while the nation transforms around her faster each year. In portraits, she appears composed, controlled, regal, but real life inside the palaces remains messier. She falls deeply in love with her cousin Albert. She argues fiercely with advisors. She laughs loudly sometimes. She dislikes certain politicians intensely. She can be affectionate 1 hour and cold the next. The monarchy survives partly because Victoria gradually learns how to appear emotionally legible to the public. Not distant exactly. Human, but elevated. A wife, a mother, a widow eventually. Victorian Britain will build enormous emotional myths around her over time, but tonight, in these earlier years, the country still smells mostly of rain, machinery, and coal smoke, and in thousands of factory windows across the darkened cities, candlelight flickers weakly beside exhausted workers preparing to do it all again tomorrow. The trains arrive like weather. At first you hear only a distant trembling somewhere beyond the fields. Then the rails begin humming faintly beneath the ground. Horses shift nervously beside muddy roads. Farmers pause mid-conversation. Children run toward embankments to watch the enormous black machines appear through drifting steam. And suddenly there it is. Iron, smoke, speed. A locomotive bursts across the countryside, pulling carriages filled with businessmen, clerks, mothers, soldiers, anxious travellers, crates of newspapers, sacks of letters, and sometimes livestock complaining loudly in the cold. Then it is gone again, only the smoke lingers. The Victorian railway age changes Britain so completely that people living through it sometimes struggle to describe the feeling. Historians later compare it to the arrival of the internet or electricity. Distances collapse, habits change, entire industries reorganize themselves around movement. Before railways, long travel is physically punishing for most people. Roads remain uneven and muddy, stagecoaches are cramped, cold, and exhausting. A journey from London to Manchester can consume days. Now the same distance shrinks dramatically, and something inside the national imagination shifts with it. I begin to notice how the stations themselves feel almost ceremonial. Huge iron arches rise above platforms crowded with steam and echoing footsteps. Porters wheel trunks through confusion and noise. Conductors shout destinations. Ladies grip hats against gusts of smoke-filled wind. Everything smells faintly of hot metal and wet wool. Inside the carriages, strangers sit inches apart for hours at a time. Victorian society is still deeply conscious of class. Of course, first-class passengers travel in comfort compared to labourers packed into cheaper compartments, but railways still force new kinds of accidental proximity upon people. A banker may overhear a factory worker coughing through the journey north. A nervous governess may sit beside soldiers returning from Ireland. A grieving widow may stare silently across from a young couple discussing seaside holidays. Britain becomes psychologically smaller. Even time behaves differently now. Station clocks begin ruling ordinary life with startling authority. Miss a train by 2 minutes and the consequences ripple outward through entire days. Businesses reorganize schedules around arrivals and departures. Families arrange visits with increasing precision. Victorian people become more aware of minutes. There is something strangely exhausting about this modernity, even in its excitement. Writers of the time sometimes describe train travel as physically unsettling. Speeds above 30 miles per hour once seemed dangerous to human health. Certain doctors worry rapid movement might damage the body or overwhelm the nervous system. Older passengers occasionally cling to seats in terror during early journeys. You can understand it a little. Imagine spending your whole life moving at the pace of horses, then suddenly racing through dark countryside faster than your mind comfortably processes. Villages blur past windows, trees vanish into smoke, telegraph poles flick rhythmically beside the tracks. The human nervous system is trying to catch up with the industrial acceleration. Outside London especially, railways redraw the map of daily existence. Small towns connected to major lines flourish quickly, others decline when bypassed. Coastal resorts expand as middle-class families discover leisure travel. Seaside air becomes fashionable, almost medicinal. Doctors recommend salt water and rest for exhausted urban professionals. After months inside smoky industrial cities, the coast must feel almost unreal. Cold wind, open sky, waves instead of machinery. You can picture Victorian families arriving awkwardly beside the sea carrying luggage and too many layers of clothing. Children shriek with delight. Mothers worry about sand-ruining garments. Fathers attempt dignity while avoiding icy water. For a few days, factory smoke feels far away. The railways also transform the movement of food, information, and death. Fresh fish reaches inland cities quickly enough to remain edible. Newspapers printed in London arrive across Britain with unprecedented speed. Troops travel faster during moments of unrest. Even funerals change as bodies can now be transported long distances for burial. Modern Britain is assembling itself, piece by piece, through iron tracks, and beneath the optimism sits enormous speculation. Money floods into railway projects during the 1840s. Investors become feverish with excitement. Newspapers praise fortunes made overnight. Clerks, widows, businessmen, and shopkeepers all rush to buy shares in new railway companies. Some lines are genuinely useful, others are absurd fantasies. There are stories of proposed railways cutting through nearly empty countryside simply because investors cannot tolerate missing the boom. Maps fill with ambitious pencil lines stretching toward imagined prosperity. Then comes the collapse. The railway mania eventually bursts like many financial bubbles before and after it. Fortunes vanish, companies fail, families lose savings carefully accumulated across decades. The Victorian era adores progress, but it also worships speculation with alarming enthusiasm, and ordinary people usually absorb the consequences. Still, the trains continue running in third-class carriages. Factory workers travel seeking employment in unfamiliar towns. Young women leave villages for domestic service positions in distant cities. Men chase rumours of wages, construction projects, dock work. Some never return home. Railways quietly loosen traditional community bonds. People become more mobile, more anonymous. A person can disappear into another city now with unsettling ease. This mobility carries loneliness with it. Victorian letters are full of homesickness. Mothers writing to sons in London. Sisters separated by industrial migration. Fathers apologising for long absences while chasing work opportunities across expanding rail networks. Industrial modernity promises opportunity but often delivers separation first. Queen Victoria herself becomes deeply associated with railway travel over time. Royal tours by train allow the monarchy to appear physically closer to the public. Crowds gather at stations hoping to glimpse her passing carriage. There is something almost theatrical about it. Steam drifting beneath station lamps. Soldiers standing rigidly along platforms. Local officials bowing nervously. Children lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Victoria understands a public image increasingly well by now, and Prince Albert especially embraces industrial progress with genuine enthusiasm, intelligent, serious, and intensely organised. Albert believes technology and education can improve society meaningfully. He studies engineering, supports scientific institutions, and encourages modernisation projects constantly. At times he feels more comfortable discussing machinery than court gossip. Some Britons distrust him because he is German-born, others find him cold, yet Victoria adores him with startling openness. Their marriage becomes central to the monarchy's public identity. Not perfect, certainly. They quarrel often enough. Albert can be controlling, Victoria can be emotionally volatile, but the affection is real. You see it in surviving letters, in the small observations recorded by servants, in the rhythm of their domestic life. For all the grandeur surrounding royalty, much of existence still revolves around ordinary human needs: rest, affection, reassurance, warm rooms during winter rain. Outside palace walls, the railway age presses onward through the countryside. Ancient forests are cut back for tracks. Tunnels pierce hillsides once considered immovable. Rural silence breaks beneath whistles echoing across valleys at dawn. Some people mourn what disappears, and something is disappearing. Older patterns of slowness, seasonal isolation, the natural patience enforced by geography. Victorian Britain is becoming faster, louder, more connected, and more emotionally strained all at once. Late at night, Station workers sweep nearly empty platforms beneath flickering gas lamps. Somewhere, a telegraph clicks softly in the darkness, far down the tracks. Another train approaches through rain and smoke, carrying tired passengers deeper into the century. Inside the Victorian home, silence develops its own manners. Doors close softly. Teacups touch saucers with careful restraint. People apologize for emotions before fully expressing them. Even laughter sometimes arrives politely dressed, as though it should not disturb the wallpaper. By the middle decades of the 19th century, respectability has become almost a national obsession among Britain's growing middle class. Not wealth alone, appearance, conduct, cleanliness, self-control, especially self-control, are beginning to notice how much effort goes into maintaining the correct atmosphere inside these homes. Parlours are arranged carefully with upholstered chairs, framed landscapes, porcelain ornaments, family Bibles, polished clocks, and heavy curtains designed to keep out cold draughts and curious neighbours alike. Nothing is accidental. A visitor entering the room should immediately understand what kind of people live there. At least, that is the hope. The house itself becomes a public statement disguised as a private refuge. And after the noise of industrial streets, the quiet can feel deeply comforting at first. Coal fires burn low behind iron grates. Lamps cast soft amber light against patterned wallpaper. Rain taps gently against windows while someone turns pages beside the hearth. The smell of starch, tea leaves, and furniture polish settles into fabric over time. Victorian evenings often unfold slowly. A father reads newspapers after supper. A daughter practices piano exercises she secretly hates. Younger children complete lessons beneath watchful supervision. Mothers mend clothing under fading lamplight while trying not to reveal their exhaustion. Outside, carriage wheels scrape faintly through wet streets. Inside, people perform stability for one another. There is tenderness here sometimes, genuine tenderness. Parents kiss sleeping children before bed. Brothers tease sisters affectionately. Couples develop quiet domestic rituals over years together. Family photographs, still relatively new, are treasured carefully because images remain expensive and slightly magical. Yet loneliness drifts through these homes too. The Victorian world draws sharp boundaries around emotion, especially among the respectable classes. Public dignity matters intensely. Many people struggle to discuss fear, desire, grief, or disappointment openly if feelings become coded into gestures, routines, and long silences around dinner tables. A man may work himself towards collapse rather than admit anxiety. A woman may suffer crushing isolation while still hosting flawless afternoon tea. You can feel it sitting quietly in the room long enough. Even architecture reflects this emotional compartmentalization. Victorian homes divide life into separate spaces with remarkable precision. Drawing rooms for guests, dining rooms for formal meals, nurseries for children, servants' quarters tucked discreetly away from family life. Privacy increases. So does emotional distance. Sometimes, children of wealthy and middle-class families are often raised partly by nurses or governesses. Affection exists, certainly, but physical closeness between parents and children can feel restrained by modern standards. Certain fathers remain almost ceremonial figures within their own households. Not always cold, just distant. Meanwhile, servants move quietly through the edges of domestic life like invisible machinery keeping the entire illusion functioning. A maid rises before dawn to light fires in freezing rooms before the family wakes. Cooks labour for hours beneath suffocating kitchen heat. Housemaids carry water upstairs repeatedly until their backs ache. Footmen answer bells that summon them constantly from hidden corridors. The Victorian ideal of comfort rests heavily upon unseen labour, and the servants themselves live in strange emotional territory, intimately close to family life, yet never truly part of it. They overhear arguments, witness illnesses, observe private grief, They know which marriages are unhappy long before neighbours suspect anything. Still, they remain mostly silent. A good servant is expected to disappear into efficiency for young women entering domestic service from poor rural families. The adjustment can feel overwhelming. Suddenly they inhabit enormous urban houses with unfamiliar rules governing posture, speech, clothing, even eye contact. One mistake may cost employment, and employment often means survival. The Victorian household runs on anxiety more than it likes admitting. Anxiety about status, reputation, money, morality, illness, scandal, social decline. Especially decline. Britain's middle classes live with a persistent fear of slipping downward economically. A failed business, prolonged sickness, gambling debt, or public disgrace can damage entire families permanently. Respectability must therefore be maintained continuously, almost offensively. Curtains cleaned, shoes polished, children disciplined, emotions managed. Appearances become exhausting work. Women carry much of this burden. Victorian culture praises women as moral guardians of the home, naturally gentle and spiritually refined. Paintings depict serene mothers guiding innocent children through peaceful domestic scenes. Reality feels less tranquil. Many women experience endless pregnancies, dangerous childbirths, chronic fatigue, and emotional confinement within rigid expectations. Legal rights remain severely limited for much of the century. Married women initially possess little control over property or earnings, and yet within these restrictions, women still build complex emotional lives. Friendships between women often become deeply intimate. Letters overflow with affection, frustration, humour, loneliness. Some women pursue writing quietly. Others organise charitable work or educational projects that gradually widen female influence beyond the home. Small acts of resistance accumulate solely across decades. You can sense the pressure building beneath Victorian domestic order. Even clothing reflects it physically. Middle and upper class women wear tight corsets, heavy layered skirts, petticoats, gloves, boots, jewellery, carefully arranged hairstyles. Dressing properly takes time and assistance. The body itself becomes disciplined into fashionable restraint. Men suffer their own uniforms of seriousness. Dark suits, stiff collars, formal hats, controlled posture. Everyone is slightly uncomfortable, and beneath these polished surfaces lies constant awareness of death. Victorian families encounter mortality intimately and often. Diseases still move rapidly through crowded cities. Tuberculosis lingers for years inside weakened lungs. Cholera outbreaks terrify entire neighbourhoods. Children die with heartbreaking frequency compared to modern expectations, or almost every household carries grief. Mourning rituals therefore become elaborate and emotionally important. Mirrors covered after deaths, black clothing worn for prescribed periods, locks of hair preserved inside jewellery, post-mortem photographs taken because they may be the only images ever captured of a loved one. The Victorians are sometimes mocked today for their relationship with mourning, but when death lives so close beside ordinary life, remembrance becomes its own form of tenderness. Queen Victoria herself will eventually shape national mourning culture profoundly after Prince Albert dies, but even before that devastating loss, emotional restraint already coexists with deep undercurrents of sorrow throughout British society. People simply learn to carry grief quietly. Late in the evening, after guests leave and servants extinguish lamps downstairs, Victorian homes often feel strangely hollow. Floorboards creak softly as the house settles into darkness. Ashes cool inside fireplaces. Somewhere a clock ticks through empty rooms. A woman sits awake beside candlelight, finishing repairs on children's clothing. A husband stares silently at unpaid bills after everyone else sleeps. A governess misses her own family too intensely to rest properly. The curtains are drawn, the silver polished, the parlour respectable. Yet loneliness remains seated gently beside the fire, warming its hands in silence while rain moves steadily across the windows of the sleeping city. By evening, the empire reaches the dinner table, not as maps or speeches at first, but as ordinary objects touched without much thought. White sugar dissolving into tea, cotton dresses folded carefully into wardrobes, tobacco smoke curling above conversation, spices resting quietly in kitchen cupboards beside flour and salt. The Victorian Empire often arrives disguised as comfort. You sit inside a warm middle-class dining room somewhere in the 1850s, while rain drifts softly against the windows, candles flicker across silverware, a servant carries roasted meat into the room. Someone complains mildly about railway delays. Someone else discusses business opportunities overseas, and almost every item on the table connects invisibly to distant labour. Tea from India or China, sugar from Caribbean plantations, coffee from Ceylon, mahogany furniture from tropical forests, cotton shaped by enslaved labour earlier in the century, then by poorly paid workers afterward. The empire enters British homes quietly, then becomes impossible to separate from daily life. Victorian Britain does not merely own colonies, it organises much of its economy, identity, and emotional self-confidence around imperial expansion. Ships move constantly between ports carrying goods, soldiers, administrators, missionaries, engineers, and ambitious young men hoping to reinvent themselves abroad. At the London docks, the world seems to arrive continuously through fog and river water. You can imagine the smells alone: wet rope, salt wind, coal smoke, fish scales, tar, imported spices spilling faint perfume into damp air, sailors shouting beside cranes unloading cargo from every corner of the expanding empire. The river never truly rests, and somewhere behind all this movement sits a growing national belief that Britain has a special destiny in the world. Many Victorians sincerely believe imperial rule spreads civilization, trade, Christianity, law, and technological progress. Others see profit first and morality afterward. Often both exist together inside the same person without obvious contradiction. This is one of the unsettling truths about the era. Empire does not feel monstrous to most people living comfortably within it. It feels normal, necessary even. Newspapers celebrate territorial expansion routinely. Schoolboys memorize maps colored red with imperial possessions. Public ceremonies praise military victories overseas. Distance softens cruelty. The further suffering occurs from London parlours, the easier it becomes to frame conquest as benevolence. Yet evidence of violence still surfaces constantly. Letters return describing brutal heat, disease, exhaustion, rebellion, and military reprisals. Soldiers come home missing limbs. Colonial administrators die young from tropical illnesses. Missionaries write about famine and conflict beside hopeful reports of conversion. The empire consumes British lives too, though unevenly. For poorer families, especially military service abroad can appear strangely attractive despite its dangers. A regular wage matters, food matters, escape from industrial poverty matters. Young recruits board transport ships with mixed emotions, fear hidden beneath excitement, pride tangled with homesickness before departure even begins. Some have never seen the ocean before. You can picture them standing awkwardly along crowded docks while mothers cry quietly into handkerchiefs. Sweethearts promise letters. Fathers attempt practical advice instead of tenderness. Then the ropes are cast off, and the ship disappears gradually into grey water, far away. Imperial rule reshapes entire societies through trade demands, military pressure, legal systems, and resource extraction. Railways spread across colonies as they do across Britain, though often serving imperial control before local needs. Cash crops replace traditional agriculture in certain regions. Local industries weaken under British manufacturing power. The empire speaks constantly about order, yet its expansion frequently produces instability first. In India especially, British influence grows enormously through the East India Company before direct crown rule eventually follows. Company officials, soldiers, merchants, and administrators build careers across the subcontinent while remaining emotionally suspended between two worlds. Some adapt deeply to local cultures, others isolate themselves inside rigid British communities abroad. Many simply feel lonely. Colonial life often carries strange emotional dislocation. British families recreate fragments of home in unfamiliar climates, while servants move quietly through households where language, race, class, and power intertwine constantly. Tea is poured carefully while monsoon rain pounds against shutters. Children play in gardens beneath unbearable heat while parents discuss England almost obsessively as though memory itself might cool the air. And beneath these domestic routines sits military force. Always, the empire depends ultimately upon violence or the threat of it. Forts, warships, rifles, punishments, occupation. The polished confidence of Victorian imperial culture rests on foundations far harsher than many comfortable Britons fully acknowledge. Then in 1857 India erupts. The uprising known historically as the Indian Rebellion or Sepoy Mutiny begins among Indian soldiers employed by the East India Company, but rapidly expands into a vast and chaotic conflict. Accounts of atrocities spread in all directions. British civilians are killed. Rebel cities resist fiercely. Imperial reprisals become devastating. Fear overtakes Britain almost immediately. Newspapers print horrifying stories, some accurate, some exaggerated by panic and propaganda. Public anger hardens rapidly. Demands for revenge grow loud and emotional. And once again, distance distorts understanding. For many people in Britain, the rebellion confirms fears about imperial fragility and colonial resistance. For many Indians, it reflects accumulated resentment against foreign control, economic disruption, and cultural intrusion. The violence scars both societies deeply. Afterward, the British government dissolves the East India Company and assumes direct rule over India. Queen Victoria eventually becomes Empress of India decades later. A symbolic transformation revealing how central empire has become to British identity. Yet Victoria herself often views imperial subjects with more complexity than certain politicians around her. She shows genuine curiosity about Indian culture later in life, even while remaining fully committed to imperial rule. Human beings rarely fit neatly into moral categories. The Victorian Empire certainly does not at home. Imperial wealth continues flowing visibly through British life. Museums fill with artifacts gathered across the world. Exotic goods appear in fashionable shops. Adventure novels romanticize colonial exploration for eager young readers. Meanwhile, working-class families in industrial cities still struggle to afford decent food. That contradiction never fully leaves the empire either. A nation may rule vast territories overseas while children nearby go hungry beside polluted rivers. And still people continue believing in progress. Perhaps they must. The alternative would require confronting too much at once. Late at night in London, after wealthy households finish dinner and servants clear the plates away, imported tea leaves remain damp inside silver pots. Outside, fog curls along the streets beside exhausted dock workers unloading another ship beneath gaslight. Crates stamped with distant place names disappear into warehouses. Somewhere beyond the dark water, another colony waits through heat and uncertainty for instructions arriving from Britain, and inside quiet homes across the empire, countless ordinary people lie awake listening to unfamiliar winds against the windows, wondering where exactly they belong now. The hunger begins quietly, not all at once, not with dramatic scene of immediate collapse. First there are worried conversations beside kitchen fires, then smaller meals, then the uneasy habit of checking potato stores again and again, hoping the rot has somehow stopped spreading during the night. But it has not stopped across Ireland in the 1840s. The potato crop blackens and dissolves in the ground beneath a strange fungal blight carried through damp air and wet fields. Families dig into the earth expecting food and find foul-smelling ruin instead. The smell stays with people afterward. Wheat at first, then rotten, potatoes are not merely one food among many for Ireland's rural poor. For millions, they are survival itself. Entire households depend upon tiny rented plots producing enough potatoes to sustain large families through the year. The system is already fragile long before the blight arrives. Too many people, too little land, too much dependence on a single crop. And above it all sits British rule. You walk through rural Ireland during these years and immediately feel the exhaustion woven into ordinary life. Mud cabins with leaking roofs, barefoot children standing silently beside ditches, thin smoke escaping from turf fires, wet clothing hanging indoors because the rain rarely seems finished. Yet there is warmth too. Neighbours share what little they have. Families crowd close beside weak fires during stormy evenings. Songs drift through certain villages after dark. Priests move constantly between homes offering comfort, news, and prayers. People endure because they are used to enduring. Then the potatoes fail repeatedly, not once, again and again. By 1846, the crisis deepens into catastrophe. Hunger spreads across enormous regions of Ireland with terrifying speed. Families eat seed potatoes meant for future planting because there is nothing else. Livestock disappears, furniture is sold, clothing vanishes piece by piece. After a while, even dignity becomes difficult to maintain on an empty stomach. Contemporary observers describe roads filled with wandering people searching desperately for work or food. Workhouses overflow rapidly, fever spreads through weakened bodies. Mothers stop producing milk for infants. Entire villages begin thinning into silence, and still food continues leaving Ireland. This remains one of the most painful truths of the famine years. Ireland produces grain, livestock, butter, and other agricultural goods throughout the crisis, much of it exported to Britain under existing economic systems. Historians still debate certain details of responsibility and inevitability, but few dispute the devastating failures of policy, ideology, and relief. The British government does provide some aid. Public works projects appear. Soup kitchens briefly operate. Officials debate intervention constantly, but the response remains deeply shaped by economic beliefs emphasizing limited government interference and market principles. Certain policymakers fear creating dependency more than mass starvation. Others carry ugly assumptions about the Irish poor themselves. Prejudice seeps through official language repeatedly during these years. Some British commentators describe the famine almost as a harsh corrective to Irish society, rather than a human disaster demanding overwhelming intervention. Distance hardens compassion once again. In London drawing rooms, discussions about Irish suffering often become abstract remarkably quickly. Budgets, trade concerns, political calculations. Meanwhile, people die beside cold hearths. You can almost feel the terrible slowness of bureaucracy moving against the speed of hunger. Letters requesting aid travel through rain and mud toward officials who may never witness the conditions directly. Landlords attempt evictions because unpaid rents continue accumulating. Families disappear onto overcrowded coffin ships bound for North America. Many never survive the crossing. The Atlantic becomes another graveyard. Inside emigrant vessels, conditions are often horrifying. Disease spreads rapidly through cramped quarters. Food remains inadequate. Storms terrify exhausted passengers already weakened by starvation. Parents bury children at sea wrapped in blankets weighted gently into dark water. And still the ships keep leaving, because remaining sometimes feels even more hopeless. The emotional wound left by the famine reaches across generations. Entire communities fracture through death and emigration. Survivors carry grief mixed with anger, shame, endurance, and silence. Some never speak about certain memories again, others speak about little else. The population of Ireland falls dramatically through death and migration during and after the famine years. The social consequences reshape Irish and British history permanently. Resentment toward British governance deepens profoundly. Trust collapses in many regions, and beneath political history lies something even quieter. The loneliness of abandoned places, villages emptied gradually by hunger and emigration, roofless cottages collapsing beneath rain, fields returning slowly to grass where families once fought desperately for survival, paths growing over because nobody remains to walk them anymore. A strange stillness settles across parts of rural Ireland afterward. Queen Victoria donates personally to famine relief and encourages charitable efforts. She is not indifferent, yet symbolic gestures cannot compensate for structural failure on this scale. Later generations will remember her differently in Ireland than in Britain. History often preserves emotion as much as fact. The famine years also reveal uncomfortable truths about Victorian confidence. Britain considers itself the most advanced industrial power on earth, proud of progress, trade, engineering, and imperial reach. Yet within the United Kingdom itself, mass starvation unfolds, and not in some remote medieval past, in the age of railways, newspapers, expanding bureaucracy, and industrial wealth. The contradiction is impossible to ignore once seen clearly. Some British observers do recognise the horror fully. Journalists publish devastating descriptions. Relief workers exhaust themselves attempting to help. Certain politicians demand stronger intervention, but moral urgency fragments against politics, prejudice, economics, and sheer administrative confusion. By the time more substantial relief arrives in certain regions, thousands are already gone. Late at night, in overcrowded workhouses across Ireland, weakened families lie listening to coughs echo through long rooms, smelling of sickness and damp straw. Outside, rain moves across dark fields where the potato crop has failed again. A child asks quietly for food that no longer exists. A mother pretends not to hear because answering would require words she cannot bear saying aloud. And far across the water in London, candlelight flickers gently across polished dinner tables, while politicians continue debating costs, principles, responsibilities, and consequences deep into the evening. The empire feels enormous then. The distance between suffering and power feels even larger. By the early 1850s, the worst of the famine begins easing gradually. Crops recover unevenly, certain regions stabilise, but Ireland has changed permanently. So has Britain, though it understands this less clearly, because once a government watches mass hunger unfold within its own borders, some quiet illusion of moral certainty begins cracking beneath the surface. And long after the statistics fade into textbooks, the emotional memory remains. Cold rain, empty fields, ships vanishing westward into grey Atlantic fog. London breathes differently after dark. The city never truly sleeps by the middle of the 19th century. It slows perhaps, softens around the edges, but even near midnight, wheels still clatter across bridges. Footsteps echo through narrow lanes, and distant voices drift upward through damp air carrying fragments of argument, laughter, or exhaustion. The gaslights glow through fog like blurred moons. You stand beside the Thames on a cold evening sometime in the 1850s and feel the sheer scale of the place pressing outward in every direction. Warehouses, factories, churches, slums, theatres, markets, government offices, counting houses, taverns, palaces. More than 2 million people now crowd into London. Soon there will be many more. It is the largest city on earth, and it smells terrible. That detail appears constantly in Victorian descriptions because there is no avoiding it. Coal smoke hangs low over entire districts. Horse manure cakes the streets. Industrial waste drains into the river. Human sewage flows opally through poorer neighbourhoods when systems fail or simply do not exist. During summer heat, the odour becomes almost unbearable. The Thames itself sometimes resembles a slow-moving chemical wound cutting through the city centre. Contemporary observers describe dead animals floating beside industrial runoff while boat traffic continues around them as though nothing unusual has occurred. People adapt to astonishing conditions when they must. Still, London possesses a strange magnetism even beneath the filth. Money gathers here, opportunity, culture, power, news, fashion, crime, entertainment, ruin. A person can disappear into London completely or reinvent themselves there almost overnight. That possibility draws people constantly from every corner of Britain and far beyond. You see them arriving at railway stations carrying carpet bags and nervous ambition. Young clerks seeking office work, seamstresses searching for employment, Irish labourers escaping famine, foreign political exiles, provincial girls hoping for respectable domestic service. Some find stability, others vanish quietly into poverty. The city contains both outcomes side by side. In wealthy districts like Mayfair or Belgravia, polished carriages roll toward elegant townhouses where servants prepare elaborate dinners beneath crystal chandeliers. Ladies step carefully from carriages onto dry pavements while footmen hold umbrellas against drifting rain. Inside, conversation moves smoothly between politics, music, imperial affairs, and marriage prospects. Silver glitters softly beneath candlelight. Meanwhile, only a few miles away, entire families crowd into single rooms in Whitechapel or Southwark. Children sleep beside exhausted parents on damp mattresses, stuffed with straw. Disease spreads rapidly through overcrowded lodging houses. Water pumps become sources of terror during cholera outbreaks. Victorian London often feels like several different cities occupying the same physical space without fully acknowledging one another. And everywhere there is noise. Street vendors shouting beneath windows, dock workers unloading cargo through the night, church bells marking hours across overlapping neighbourhoods, newspaper boys calling headlines through crowded intersections, drunken singing outside taverns after midnight. Even silent sounds crowded here. For middle-class Victorians, the city produces complicated emotions, excitement mixed with anxiety, pride mixed with disgust. London symbolises national greatness while simultaneously exposing industrial society's deepest failures. Social reformers walk through slum districts documenting conditions with growing alarm. Journalists describe starving children, prostitution, alcoholism, overcrowding, and preventable disease in painful detail. Charitable organisations expand rapidly, attempting to address visible suffering. Yet the scale overwhelms almost everyone. You could spend years walking London streets and still never understand the whole city. One district smells of fresh bread and tobacco smoke. Another smells of sewage and illness. Turn a corner and the atmosphere changes completely. The Victorians become fascinated by this complexity. Writers especially. Charles Dickens wanders London obsessively, transforming urban observation into fiction that captures both the energy and cruelty of the age. His novels resonate deeply because readers recognise the emotional truth beneath the exaggeration. London can feel wildly alive one moment and unbearably lonely the next. A clerk dismissed from employment may drift anonymously through crowded streets knowing nobody will notice his disappearance. A widow may spend entire evenings staring from rented windows onto endless human movement below without speaking to another person. The city surrounds people constantly while isolating them at the same time. And then there are the fogs. Not ordinary fog exactly, though London certainly has plenty of river mist and damp weather naturally. Victorian industrial pollution combines with atmospheric conditions to create dense yellow-grey smog that settles across the city like a living thing. Street lamps become blurry halos. Buildings vanish half a block away. Coal smoke enters lungs with every breath. Contemporary accounts describe pedestrians losing direction in familiar neighbourhoods because visibility disappears almost completely. Cab drivers sometimes walk beside horses holding lanterns inches from the ground, searching for curbs. Inside homes, soot settles onto curtains, clothing, skin, food. No surface remains untouched for long. The wealthy escape occasionally to country estates or seaside holidays. The poor breathe London continuously. Public health slowly becomes impossible to ignore. Cholera, outbreaks during the century kill thousands and terrify entire neighbourhoods. At first, many officials still believe disease spreads mainly through foul air rather than contaminated water. Certain doctors challenge these assumptions gradually through careful observation. One physician, John Snow, famously traces a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump in Soho during the 1850s. His work helps transform modern understanding of disease transmission, though acceptance comes slowly. The Victorians are learning painfully that cities require infrastructure, not merely expansion. Sewers eventually become one of London's greatest engineering achievements after repeated public health disasters and the infamous Great Stink of 1858, when summer heat intensifies the river's odour so severely that even Parliament struggles functioning beside the Thames. Imagine lawmakers attempting serious debate while handkerchiefs soaked in perfume press against their faces. History rarely loses its sense of irony entirely. Queen Victoria dislikes London more than many assume. She often prefers Windsor or Osborne House away from the capital's noise and grime. Prince Albert, more intellectually engaged with urban modernisation, shows stronger interest in improving housing, sanitation, and cultural institutions. Together they help shape a monarchy increasingly tied to domestic respectability rather than purely aristocratic display. But beneath royal image-making, the city continues expanding relentlessly. Gaslight transforms nighttime life profoundly. Streets once dangerous after dark become more active and commercially vibrant. Theatres flourish, shops remain open later. Evening entertainment expands for those who can afford it. Yet gaslight also reveals things. Poverty becomes more visible beneath the illuminated streets. So do loneliness, prostitution, drunkenness, and crime. Victorian moral anxiety grows partly because urban life places strangers constantly into shared public spaces. The city feels thrilling. The city feels threatening. Both are true. Late at night, after rain washes briefly across the streets, London sometimes falls into a strange temporary quiet. Carriages grow less frequent. Taverns empty gradually. Shopkeepers extinguish lamps one by one. But somewhere along the river, workers still unload ships beneath weak lantern light. Somewhere in a cramped attic room, a seamstress still stitches clothing for wealthy strangers while fighting sleep. And somewhere beneath the drifting smoke and endless rooftops, millions of people lie awake listening to the great city breathe around them, wondering whether it notices them at all. Fear travels quickly through Victorian streets, sometimes faster than facts. A window shatters in the night and suddenly an entire neighbourhood whispers about gangs. A body discovered beside the river becomes newspaper sensation by morning. Rumours drift through taverns, railway stations, factory yards, and drawing rooms alike until nobody remembers where the story began. London especially lives in a permanent state of nervous attention by the second half of the century. Too many people, too much darkness. Too many strangers brushing shoulders without knowing one another's names. The city feels difficult to control. You notice it most clearly after midnight. Gas lamps throw uncertain pools of light onto wet pavement, while entire stretches of street remain hidden in shadow between them. Policemen walk slow patrol routes carrying truncheons and rattles, boots scraping softly against stones slick with rain and horse filth. Their presence comforts some people, others distrust them immediately. Modern policing is still relatively new in Britain. The Metropolitan Police forms in 1829 are many early Victorians. Organised police forces resemble foreign tyranny. Working-class communities especially can view officers as intrusive agents of social control rather than protectors. Yet urban growth makes some form of policing increasingly unavoidable. There are simply too many opportunities for crime in a city this vast. Pickpockets work crowded markets and railway stations with astonishing skill. Burglars study wealthy households carefully before striking. Prostitutes negotiate survival beneath gaslight while violent men circle through the same streets looking for vulnerability. And all of it feeds the newspapers. Victorian journalism grows more sensational as printing technology improves and literacy expands. Cheap papers compete aggressively for attention. Crime stories sell wonderfully because they offer readers both excitement and reassurance. Look how dangerous the city is. Look how respectable you are by comparison. At breakfast tables across Britain, families unfold newspapers carrying detailed accounts of murders, robberies, executions, scandals, and courtroom drama. Readers linger over grisly descriptions while pretending moral disapproval. Human curiosity rarely changes much across centuries. Public executions remain part of this atmosphere for decades. Until 1868, hangings in Britain occur before crowds. Thousands gather outside prisons to watch condemned prisoners die. Vendors sell food and alcohol nearby. Some spectators treat the events almost like festivals. Others arrive shaken but unable to stay away. The emotional tone is deeply unsettling. A man climbs the scaffold while rain drifts through the crowd. Children sit on shoulders for a better view. People joke nervously to hide discomfort. Then the trapdoor falls and a strange silence ripples outward for a few seconds before conversation resumes. Victorian society speaks constantly about morality while displaying punishment publicly as spectacle. Eventually many reformers argue execution should move behind prison walls because public hangings encourage brutality rather than discourage it. By the late century, they disappear from public view. But the appetite for crime stories remains, perhaps because industrial urban life produces profound anxiety about an anonymity. In small rural communities, people generally know one another. In London, a neighbour may remain a stranger for years. Respectable appearances can hide desperate realities. The Victorians become obsessed with hidden identities, gentlemen maintaining secret debts, clerks forging documents, wives poisoning husbands, servants stealing quietly from households they know intimately. Crime fiction flourishes because it reflects real social unease, and beneath all this lies alcohol. Gin shops and public houses crowd many urban districts. After brutal factory shifts or exhausting labour, drink offers warmth, temporary escape, conversation, forgetfulness. Taverns glow invitingly against cold streets where rainwater gathers along the curbs. Inside, the atmosphere changes completely. Pipe smoke thickens the air, glasses clink, someone sings badly in the corner. Dock workers argue about wages while a barmaid wipes spills from rough wooden counters. For a few hours, loneliness becomes communal, but alcoholism destroys families. Families too. Wages disappear into drink while children go hungry. Domestic violence shadows countless households. Farmers campaign fiercely for temperance, warning that alcohol corrodes morality and discipline alike. They are not entirely wrong, yet neither are the exhausted workers seeking relief wherever they can find it. Victorian life leaves many people physically and emotionally depleted. Prisons expand during the century as ideas about punishment evolve. Earlier systems often emphasize spectacle and physical suffering. Gradually, authorities shift toward incarceration, surveillance, discipline, and supposed rehabilitation. The architecture itself becomes psychologically revealing. Loom corridors, iron doors, tiny cells, strict routines governing silence, labour, and movement. Certain prisons enforce complete isolation for prisoners during early periods of confinement because reformers believe solitude encourages moral reflection. Instead, it often produces mental collapse. Some inmates emerge unable to speak normally after prolonged silence. The Victorian belief in discipline can become frighteningly intense once attached to institutions. Workhouses operate under similar principles. Poverty itself is treated increasingly as something requiring regulation and moral correction. Conditions inside workhouses remain deliberately harsh to discourage dependency on public assistance. Families are separated upon entry, food is basic and repetitive, privacy nearly disappears. To many poor Victorians, the workhouse represents not relief but humiliation. Still, desperation drives people there constantly. I begin to notice a pattern across the century after spending enough time inside it. Victorian Britain fears disorder almost obsessively. Crime, idleness, sexuality, drunkenness, political unrest, madness. Anything threatening social stability attracts both fascination and punishment, and yet many underlying causes of disorder remain unresolved. Poverty persists, housing remains overcrowded, industrial labour exhausts bodies and minds. Wealth inequality grows visible in nearly every major city. The empire projects confidence abroad while anxiety deepens at home. Queen Victoria herself survives several assassination attempts during her long reign, mostly by troubled or unstable individuals rather than organised political conspirators. These incidents shock the public but also strangely strengthen affection for the monarchy. Crowds cheer her courage afterward. The Queen learns something important through these moments. Visibility creates emotional connection. By continuing public appearances despite danger, she transforms vulnerability into symbolic resilience. The monarchy becomes less distant over time, more entwined with ordinary emotional life. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners continue navigating streets where danger feels both real and exaggerated. A woman walking alone after dark calculates risk constantly. A shopkeeper bolts doors carefully before bed. Parents warn children about certain alleys, certain neighbourhoods, certain kinds of strangers. Fear becomes part of the city's rhythm. Late at night, police lanterns move slowly through mist while church bells mark distant hours across the sleeping capital. Somewhere a drunk sings to himself beneath the railway arches. Somewhere else, footsteps quicken instinctively in an empty street, and in countless Victorian bedrooms, people lie awake after reading the evening papers, listening to rain against the windows and wondering what kind of city waits outside once the lamps burn low enough. For a little while, Britain decides to build a palace made of glass. Not a royal palace exactly, something stranger, larger. A cathedral to industry, optimism, engineering, and imperial confidence all assembled beneath one enormous transparent roof. The year is 1801, and London is preparing for the Great Exhibition. Prince Albert believes in the project deeply, more deeply, perhaps, than many people around him initially understand. Serious. Methodical, Albert spends years supporting science, education, manufacturing, and industrial innovation. He wants Britain to present itself not merely as powerful, but enlightened. The exhibition will gather inventions, machines, artworks, textiles, raw materials, and industrial achievements from across the world into one astonishing public display, a celebration of progress itself. The building constructed to house it soon becomes known simply as the Crystal Palace. You can imagine the shock of seeing it for the first time, glass walls stretching endlessly beneath the pale London sky, iron beams rising delicately despite their enormous scale, sunlight flooding the interior so brightly that visitors compare it to walking inside a dream. Nothing quite like it has ever existed before. Victorian Britain loves moments like this. Moments where technology feels almost spiritual. Crowds arrive in huge numbers from every corner of the country. Railway companies offer excursion fares. Families save carefully for the journey. Clerks, factory workers, aristocrats, foreign diplomats, engineers, teachers, and curious children all move together toward Hyde Park beneath drifting spring rain. For many ordinary visitors, the experience feels overwhelming. Inside the Crystal Palace, the world appears compressed into glittering aisles of machinery and empire. Steam engines hiss softly beside elaborate carpets from India. Precision tools sit near enormous industrial looms. Exotic woods, carved ivory, Scientific instruments, decorative ceramics, and military technologies gleam beneath the vast glass roof. The air smells faintly of oil, damp clothing, perfume, and hot metal. And above everything hangs the emotional certainty that humanity is advancing towards something magnificent, at least for the afternoon. Victorian optimism reaches one of its purest expressions here. Newspapers celebrate British engineering triumphantly. Foreign visitors marvel at industrial scale. Middle-class families wander through displays believing education and technology might genuinely improve civilization. Some of that belief is sincere. Some of it is propaganda. Usually it is both. The exhibition presents empire as orderly cooperation rather than domination. Colonies contribute materials and crafts to imperial display cases, while Britain frames itself as organizer and benefactor of global progress. The violence-sustaining imperial systems remains mostly invisible inside the glass palace. So does industrial exhaustion. A factory worker visiting the exhibition might admire magnificent machinery, while privately knowing what factory life actually feels like. The heat, the noise, the endless repetition, the coughing. Progress looks cleaner in exhibition halls. Still, wonder matters too. You should not underestimate how emotionally transformative the 19th century can feel for people living through it. Scientific discoveries multiply rapidly. Engineering projects once considered impossible suddenly become ordinary. Telegraph wires carry messages across astonishing distances. Photography captures human faces with eerie precision. The future seems to be arriving faster each decade, and the Crystal Palace gives that future physical shape. Children stare upward at towering displays with open mouths. Elderly visitors walk slowly through galleries trying to comprehend the scale of change unfolding around them. Couples pause beneath glass ceilings where sunlight breaks through drifting London clouds. For a few hours, social tension softens slightly beneath shared amazement. Then people return home, back to overcrowded housing, dangerous labour, unequal wealth, political frustration, loneliness, grief. The exhibition cannot solve these things, but it reveals something essential about Victorian Britain. The era genuinely believes material progress and moral progress belong together. Many Victorians assume technological advancement will naturally produce better societies. History keeps disappointing this assumption. Even the Crystal Palace itself contains contradictions hidden beneath beauty. The building depends upon industrial processes, powered partly by brutal labour conditions. Colonial wealth helps finance imperial confidence. Working-class visitors often arrive exhausted from the very system being celebrated, and yet many still feel proud walking through those glittering halls. Human beings can recognize exploitation while still longing to belong to something grander than themselves. Prince Albert especially shines during these years. Intelligent and relentlessly hard-working, he becomes central to projects involving science, culture, public health, and education. Over time, even many former critics admit his seriousness and competence. Victoria remains deeply devoted to him. Their relationship shapes the monarchy profoundly. Together they cultivate an image of domestic virtue and stable family life that resonates strongly with middle-class Britain. Portraits show them surrounded by children rather than isolated in royal grandeur. The monarchy becomes emotionally approachable, at least carefully approachable. Behind palace walls, life remains complicated. Victoria's temper can still flare suddenly. Albert's controlling tendencies strain certain relationships. Court politics continue exhausting everyone involved, but affection holds the centre. And in a century increasingly anxious about social disorder, the royal family begins symbolising stability itself. Outside royal circles, industrial Britain keeps accelerating. The telegraph transforms communication during these decades almost as dramatically as railways transform travel. Messages that once required days now arrive in minutes. Business changes rapidly. Newspapers become more immediate. Governments respond faster during crises. distance shrinks again. Some people find this exhilarating. Others quietly miss slower worlds already disappearing behind them. You begin noticing exhaustion spreading through Victorian life alongside of achievement. Not collapse exactly, more a persistent strain beneath the confidence. Cities expand faster than infrastructure comfortably supports. Workers labour longer hours beneath growing economic pressure. Families attempt maintaining respectability despite emotional and financial fatigue. Even leisure becomes organised increasingly around productivity and self-improvement. The age struggles to rest. Late in the century, the Crystal Palace itself will eventually be moved south to Sydenham, where it continues attracting visitors for decades before fire destroys it entirely in the 20th century. But tonight it still stands in memory untouched, glass glowing softly beneath evening light. Crowds moving through enormous halls with tired feet and astonished faces. Outside, London smoke drifts across the darkening sky while carriage wheels rattle homeward through muddy streets. Visitors carry souvenirs, guidebooks, and complicated emotions back into ordinary life. For a brief moment they have walked through a vision of modernity polished bright enough to hide its shadows. And perhaps they needed that vision, even if it was incomplete. Because the Victorian century asks people to endure extraordinary upheaval while continuing to believe progress will somehow justify the cost. Inside the Crystal Palace, under all that glass and iron, the future almost seems gentle. Almost. The Empire always seems farther away on maps, coloured neatly in red across schoolroom atlases. Imperial territories appear calm and orderly, their borders clean beneath the careful confidence of British cartography. Children trace distant coastlines with fingertips while teachers describe trade routes, naval strength, and civilizing missions in measured voices. Maps rarely smell of blood. Real imperial war smells of mud, smoke, sweat, horse manure, wet canvas, infected wounds, and fear held too tightly inside exhausted bodies. By the middle of the Victorian century, Britain fights conflicts across enormous distances with increasing regularity. Some are brief colonial campaigns barely remembered now outside military archives. Others grow into disasters impossible to ignore. And each war pulls ordinary human beings into landscapes they scarcely understand. The Crimean War begins in 1853 through a tangled mixture of imperial rivalry, religious disputes, collapsing Ottoman power, and European political anxiety. By the time British soldiers arrive near the Black Sea, many barely understand why they are there. They understand the cold quickly enough. You can picture the camps at night, rain turning roads into deep black mud, thin canvas tents snapping sharply in freezing wind, horses dying slowly from exposure. Soldiers wrapped in damp blankets beside weak fires that barely survive the weather. Nothing about it feels glorious up close. Victorian Britain still carries romantic ideas about warfare during these years. Heroism, duty, cavalry charges beneath waving flags, officers speaking calmly beneath enemy fire. The reality proves messier almost immediately. Military organisation remains chaotic. Supplies fail repeatedly, food arrives late or spoiled, medical care struggles under overwhelming conditions, bureaucratic confusion kills nearly as effectively as enemy artillery, and for the first time, the public follows much of it through modern journalism. Newspaper correspondents report from the front with unprecedented immediacy. Readers at breakfast encounter descriptions of freezing soldiers, incompetent leadership, and horrifying battlefield injuries while buttering toast beside warm fires. War enters domestic life differently now. The famous Charge of the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava captures the Victorian imagination precisely because it combines courage with terrible futility. Miscommunication sends British cavalry directly into devastating Russian artillery fire. Men reader for war. Anyway, accounts afterward describe smoke swallowing horses and riders together, while cannon fire tears through the charge. Survivors emerge stunned, bloodied, half deafened by noise and shock. The public mourns and romanticizes simultaneously. Tennyson writes poetry, newspaper, print, heroic illustration, but beneath the patriotic language sits growing discomfort about how casually military lives can be wasted. The Crimean War also transforms nursing permanently through Florence Nightingale and other medical reformers. Nightingale arrives at military hospitals and encounters conditions so filthy and disorganized they horrify even hardened observers. Injured soldiers lie crowded together among vermin, disease, and inadequate sanitation. Infection spreads rapidly. Supplies disappear into administrative confusion. More men die from illness than battle wounds. Nightingale's work becomes legendary not because she performs miracles, but because she imposes order, cleanliness, discipline, and relentless practical care inside collapsing systems. Soldiers remember the quiet sight of her, carrying a lamp through dark hospital corridors at night. The image resonates deeply with Victorian emotional culture. Compassion wrapped in discipline, tenderness expressed through duty, and beneath the symbolism lies a real exhausted woman pushing herself toward physical collapse because institutions failed vulnerable people again. The Victorian Age often depends upon individuals compensating for systemic cruelty through extraordinary personal sacrifice. Back home, families wait through long silences between letters. Wives reread fading handwriting beside candlelight. Mothers scan casualty lists in newspapers with shaking hands. Children barely remember fathers absent overseas for years. War stretches emotional distance real. The Empire requires constant movement of bodies across oceans. Soldiers board transport ships from crowded docks, knowing they may never return. Some die anonymously from disease before seeing combat at all. Heat stroke in India, malaria in Africa, cholera aboard ships. Military cemeteries spread quietly across imperial geography, and still enlistment continues for working class men especially. The army sometimes offers wages, food, structure, and escape from industrial poverty. Not comfort exactly, but possibility. Recruitment posters emphasize adventure and honor. They mention dysentery less frequently. Officers largely come from wealthier backgrounds during much of the Victorian period. Purchase systems allow aristocratic families to buy commissions for sons, reinforcing class hierarchy inside military leadership. Competence varies enormously. Some officers are brave, intelligent, genuinely respected by their men. Others are catastrophically unsuited to command. The Empire often functions through uneven improvisation hidden beneath polished ceremony, and yet the soldiers themselves keep enduring astonishing hardship, marching for miles beneath brutal sun carrying heavy equipment, sleeping in flooded camps, watching friends disappear suddenly beside them during skirmishes barely remembered by history afterward. Human beings adapt because there is rarely another option. The Indian Rebellion, earlier in the century, leaves especially deep scars on British military consciousness. Stories of massacres and reprisals harden imperial attitudes for decades. Colonial warfare grows increasingly racialized and brutal in certain regions afterward. Fear and superiority begin feeding each other. Victorian imperial confidence frequently masks insecurity underneath. British officials worry constantly about rebellion, instability, rival empires, and the fragility of control across enormous territories. The Empire looks invincible from London, less so from isolated colonial outposts during monsoon season. Queen Victoria herself develops strong emotional connections to the military over time. She corresponds with soldiers, follows campaigns closely, and understands the symbolic importance of imperial defense to national identity. After Albert's death especially, military ceremony and imperial loyalty become intertwined with her public image, but even royal admiration cannot soften the physical realities of 19th century warfare. Field hospitals smell of blood, gangrene, sweat, and carbolic acid. Surgeons amputate limbs rapidly without modern anesthesia during earlier decades. Horses scream after artillery strikes. Young soldiers age visibly within months. The body absorbs history first, long before monuments or patriotic speeches. By the later Victorian years, Britain fights conflicts in Africa, Afghanistan, Sudan, and South Africa with increasing frequency. Some victories reinforce imperial pride. Others reveal military weakness and political arrogance unexpectedly. Each war produces medals, widows, amputees, patriotic headlines, and grieving mothers nearly simultaneously. And somewhere beneath all the noise, ordinary soldiers continue writing letters home describing weather, boredom, hunger, fear, and missing familiar things. Warm bread, dry socks, a child's voice, rain on the roof of home instead of canvas overhead. Late at night inside military camps far from Britain, exhausted men sit beside weak fires cleaning rifles beneath unfamiliar stars. Wind moves softly through the dark while distant animals cry somewhere beyond the perimeter. Some men speak quietly about home, others remain silent, and across the ocean, in quiet Victorian parlours glowing with firelight, families wait for letters travelling slowly through empire, carrying news that may already be outdated by the time it arrives. The doubt arrives softly at first, not with thunder or public collapse, not with churches suddenly emptying across Britain. Victorian faith is too deeply woven into daily life for that. Bells still ring on Sundays, families still bow heads before meals, clergymen still walk damp village roads carrying sermons through the fog. But beneath the routines, something unsettled begins moving quietly through educated society. A question difficult to silence once asked clearly enough. What if the world is older, stranger, and less certain than people believed? You can feel the tension building across the middle decades of the century. Scientific discovery accelerates rapidly while traditional religious certainty struggles to absorb new ideas. Geologists uncover evidence suggesting Earth's history stretches unimaginably far beyond familiar biblical timelines. Fossils emerge from cliffs and quarries like messages from vanished worlds. Ancient creatures, extinct lives, entire ages preceding human memory. For some Victorians, these discoveries inspire awe. For others, profound emotional unease. Then, in 1859, Charles Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species, and the quiet uncertainty deepens. Darwin himself does not resemble a revolutionary prophet. He is careful, methodical, physically unwell much of the time, cautious almost to a fault. He spends decades collecting evidence before publishing his theory of evolution through natural selection. Even then, he hesitates. I understand the implication. Species are not fixed creations arranged neatly by divine design. Life changes gradually across immense spans of time through adaptation, variation, survival, extinction. Human beings are part of nature, not separate from it. The idea unsettles Victorian society deeply because it reaches beyond science into identity itself. If creation unfolds through indifferent natural processes, where exactly does moral certainty come from? What becomes of humanity's special place in the universe? People argue fiercely. Clergymen denounce Darwin publicly. Scientists defend him. Newspapers turn complex biology into sensational debate. Dinner parties fill with awkward theological conversation. And many ordinary people simply feel confused. You have to remember how emotionally central religion remains during the Victorian era. Christianity shapes education, morality, politics, family life, social expectations, even time itself through weekly rhythms and seasonal rituals. Faith provides structure. Comfort too. A grieving mother may genuinely believe she will see her child again in heaven. A labourer, exhausted by factory life, may endure partly because suffering appears meaningful within religious understanding. Churches organise charity, community, and emotional belonging across the country. To question faith, therefore, risks questioning reality itself. Yet Victorian doubt rarely looks simple or dramatic. Many people do not suddenly abandon religion after reading Darwin. Instead, they drift into uncertainty slowly. Belief becomes more complicated, harder to inhabit comfortably. A clergyman studies geology and finds himself awake late into the night staring at fossils beneath candlelight. A university student attends scientific lectures that leave familiar scriptures feeling strangely fragile afterward. A widow continues praying faithfully while quietly wondering why suffering appears so random. The century becomes spiritually tired in certain ways. Industrialization contributes to this exhaustion too. Urban life weakens older community structures. Factory schedules disrupt traditional rhythms. Scientific medicine gradually replaces certain religious explanations for illness and death. And beneath it all lies the persistent Victorian encounter with suffering. Children die despite prayer. Famine unfolds within the United Kingdom. Industrial accidents destroy body daily. The empire commits violence while describing itself as moral. For some observers, these contradictions strain faith almost beyond repair. Still, religion remains powerful because human beings continue needing Vermung. Churches stay full in many places. Religious revivals sweep through towns periodically. Missionary movements expand alongside empire. Evangelical reformers campaign passionately against slavery, prostitution, alcoholism, and poverty. Victorian Christianity contains genuine compassion alongside judgment and control. Much depends on the individual believer. Clergymen dedicate lives to helping the poor inside brutal urban conditions. Others preach harsh moral discipline from comfortable pulpits far removed from working-class reality. The same faith produces both tenderness and cruelty repeatedly across the century. Queen Victoria herself remains personally religious, though not intensely theological. Prince Albert approaches faith more intellectually, reflecting broader European currents of education and rational inquiry. Together they embody a monarchy balancing traditional morality with modern respectability. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria's grief transforms her relationship with religion profoundly. She mourns him with almost unbearable intensity. The emotional shock devastates her. She withdraws from public life for long periods. Rooms are preserved exactly as Albert left them. Clothes laid out daily. Hot water prepared each morning for a man already gone. The rituals of mourning become ways to resist finality. Spiritualism also spreads through Victorian society during these years, partly because grief saturates so many lives. Seances, mediums, ghost stories, and attempts to contact the dead fascinate people across class boundaries. Not always out of gullibility, often out of longing. When mortality remains constantly present, the desire to believe loved ones persists somewhere beyond death becomes emotionally understandable. Candlelit parlours fill with whispered hopes during seances, while tables creak softly in darkened rooms. Some participants are sincere believers, others deliberate frauds, many simply desperate for comfort. The Victorians occupy a strange emotional crossroads where scientific modernity and supernatural longing coexist inside the same households. A man may discuss evolutionary biology by afternoon and attend a séance after dinner. Human beings rarely abandon mystery completely, and despite all the intellectual upheaval, daily life continues demanding attention. Factory whistles still sound before dawn. Children still require feeding and schooling. Bills still arrive. Coal still needs carrying upstairs during winter. Most people cannot spend entire days wrestling with philosophy, yet the atmosphere changes gradually all the same. Literature grows darker in certain ways. Art becomes more introspective. Public confidence in endless progress begins developing quiet cracks beneath the surface. Even triumphs feel less certain now. The universe suddenly appears enormous beyond comfortable comprehension. Late at night in Victorian studies and bedrooms, individuals sit alone beside fading firelight reading books that unsettle them profoundly. Scientific diagrams lie open beside family Bibles. Rain touches softly against the windows while clocks mark passing hours through otherwise silent houses. A minister pauses mid-sermon draft because his certainty no longer feels complete. A young woman studying fossils feels wonder tangled strangely with fear. A grieving husband whispers prayers into darkness without knowing whether anyone hears, and across Britain, beneath church spires and factory smoke alike, an old world of certainty bins loosening its grip one thoughtful, sleepless night at a time. A Victorian woman learns early how much space she is permitted to occupy, how loudly she may speak, how directly she may disagree, how long she should hold eye contact before politeness turns into something suspicious. The lessons arrive constantly through gestures, corrections, glances across dinner tables. Sit properly, lower your voice, do not encourage attention. The rules vary by class. Of course, wealth changes almost everything in Victorian Britain except expectation itself. Aristocratic women navigate different restrictions than factory workers or servants, but all move through a society deeply invested in controlling female behaviour, especially female independence. And yet when you sit quietly inside Victorian history long enough, women appear everywhere holding the century together through labour often ignored by official records. Mothers soothing feverish children through the night while husbands work late, servants scrubbing staircases before dawn. Factory girls standing for endless hours beside dangerous machinery, widows balancing household accounts with terrified precision after a husband's death, teachers guiding overcrowded classrooms despite miserable pay. The empire, the cities, the homes, the social rituals, all of it rests partly upon female endurance. Victorian culture praises womanhood constantly while narrowing it at the same time. Ideal femininity becomes associated with purity, gentleness, domesticity, and moral refinement. Popular literature and painting celebrate the peaceful wife guiding family life through quiet virtue. Middle-class homes especially revolve around the image of the angelic woman, preserving emotional stability against the harshness of industrial society. It sounds flattering until you notice the confinement underneath. An angel in the house still belongs to the house. Married women possess remarkably limited legal rights for much of the century. Property often transfers to husbands upon marriage. Divorce remains socially devastating and legally difficult, especially for women. Employment opportunities outside domestic service or factory labour remain narrow. Respectability itself becomes a cage for many women. A middle-class wife may live comfortably compared to the poor while still feeling intellectually starved and emotionally trapped. Certain educated women spend decades managing households while privately mourning ambitions never permitted room to develop. You can feel the quiet frustration lingering beneath many Victorian letters and diaries. Not always rebellion exactly, more like suffocation softened into politeness. And then there is childbirth. Victorian motherhood carries constant physical danger. Pregnancies come frequently. Medical care remains inconsistent. Infection, hemorrhage, and exhaustion shadow family life continuously. Women die giving birth with heartbreaking regularity by modern standards. Yet society often treats motherhood as natural destiny rather than profound risk. A woman may bury multiple children across her lifetime and still continue managing the household because there is no alternative. Grief becomes folded into routine. Queen Victoria herself experiences pregnancy repeatedly and dislikes it intensely. She loves her children. But surviving letters reveal deep frustration with the physical burdens of motherhood and the restrictions placed upon women generally. She once describes pregnancy as resembling life like a rabbit or guinea pig. It is a startlingly blunt observation from the symbolic mother of the empire. Victoria embodies Victorian womanhood publicly while privately resisting parts of it emotionally. She rules an enormous empire yet still lives inside assumptions about female weakness and dependency. Contradictions surround her constantly. Prince Albert often involves himself heavily in political and domestic matters alike, partly because Victorian society still feels uneasy about direct female authority. Victoria trusts him deeply, resents him occasionally, depends upon him enormously, Their marriage contains affection, partnership, frustration, and imbalance all at once. Outside royal life, working-class women endure especially punishing conditions. Industrial labour exhausts bodies already strained by poor nutrition and overcrowded housing. In textile mills, women work long shifts surrounded by deafening machinery and floating fibres that damage lungs over time. Then they return home to unpaid labour waiting endlessly. Laundry, cooking, cleaning, childcare, mending clothing beside dim light after midnight. Rest becomes almost theoretical, and still women carve out moments of connection where they can. Friendships matter deeply in Victorian female life. Shared confidences during sewing circles, laughter exchanged while carrying water, letters written secretly about love, loneliness, anger, boredom. Women create emotional communities beneath restrictive social structures. Some push further. By the later 19th century, movements for women's education, property rights, employment reform, and suffrage begin gaining momentum more visibly. The changes arrive slowly and unevenly, but the pressure grows impossible to ignore completely. Young women increasingly seek university education. Writers challenge conventional marriage expectations. Campaigners demand voting rights, despite ridicule from newspapers and politicians alike. The Victorian era likes imagining itself stable. In reality, it is constantly shifting beneath the surface. Even clothing begins changing gradually. Earlier Victorian fashion emphasizes enormous skirts, corsets, layers of fabric restricting movement almost deliberately. Women faint frequently enough for it to become cultural cliché, though tight clothing, poor ventilation, exhaustion, and hunger contribute more than theatrical delicacy. Fashion demands discomfort as proof of refinement, but later decades introduce slightly more practical styles for certain women, especially those involved in education, reform movements, or physical activities like cycling. A woman riding a bicycle becomes unexpectedly political. Mobility itself challenges assumption. The bicycle allows independent movement through public space without male escort. Critics panic predictably. Newspapers warn cycling may damage female morality, health, or femininity. Victorian society often reacts nervously whenever women appear too physically free. Servants occupy another complicated world entirely. Domestic service employs huge numbers of women throughout the century. Young girls leave rural homes to work in urban households, where employers regulate schedules, clothing, behaviour, and sometimes personal relationships. Isolation becomes common. A maid may live surrounded by people, yet feel profoundly alone. Servants work long hours behind polished middle-class respectability while remaining socially invisible whenever possible. Still, service occasionally offers opportunities unavailable elsewhere: regular wages, escape from rural poverty, access to city life. Nothing feels simple inside Victorian social structures once examined closely, and beneath everything lies constant awareness of reputation. A man's mistakes may damage him temporarily. A woman's perceived moral failure can destroy her life permanently. Unmarried pregnancy especially carries devastating social consequences. Many women facing scandal lose employment, family support, housing, sometimes even custody of children. Victorian morality speaks endlessly about virtue while offering remarkably little mercy, yet compassion survives in unexpected places too. Certain reformers establish shelters, schools, and support networks for vulnerable women. Female friendships become lifelines. Sisters protect one another quietly from public judgment. Ordinary tenderness persists beneath rigid system. Late at night in Victorian houses across Britain, women continue working long after others sleep. A mother rocks a coughing child beside dying firelight. A servant darns stockings with aching fingers in cramped attic quarters. A widow studies unpaid bills beneath candle smoke while rain taps softly against the glass. Outside, the empire moves forward loudly through industry, politics, and war. Inside these quieter rooms, Countless women hold exhausted lives together, stitch by stitch, hour by hour, asking for far less recognition than history ever owed them. By the autumn of 1888, London is tired. Not only physically. Though exhaustion hangs over the East End like permanent weather, the city feels emotionally worn down too. Decades of industrial growth, overcrowding, poverty, scandal, political tension, and endless noise have created a strange nervous atmosphere beneath the empire's confidence. People move quickly after dark, doors bolt earlier, newspapers grow sharper, louder, hungrier for sensation, and somewhere in Whitechapel women begin dying violently in the night. The murders attributed to Jack the Ripper become one of the most famous criminal cases in modern history, though the reality at the time feels far less cinematic than later legend suggests. Mostly it feels cold. Cold streets, cold rain, cold fear settling into ordinary routines. Whitechapel sits in London's East End, crowded with poverty, casual labour, lodging houses, immigrant communities, alcohol, exhaustion, and people living one missed meal away from desperation. The district smells of smoke, sewage, wet clothing, and overcrowded humanity. Thousands drift through its streets nightly because they have nowhere else to go. Women sleep in lodging houses if they can afford the bed fee. If not, they wander until morning trying to earn enough money for shelter through sewing, cleaning, selling small goods, or prostitution. Survival becomes hourly arithmetic. One of the saddest truths about the Ripper victims is how ordinary their suffering already was before the murders made them infamous. Most are middle-aged women hardened by poverty, unstable employment, addiction, illness, or homelessness. Their lives unfold largely unnoticed by respectable society until violence suddenly forces public attention toward Whitechapel, and even then many observers respond more to horror than compassion. The murders themselves are brutal enough to shock seasoned police officers. Bodies discovered in dark streets before dawn, throats cut, mutilations suggesting terrifying intimacy between killer and victim. Newspapers erupt almost immediately. Sensational headlines spread panic through London and far beyond. Rumours multiply hourly. Every stranger becomes suspicious. Every shadowed alley acquires sinister possibilities. Victorian journalism has been preparing for a story like this for years. Crime reporting grows increasingly dramatic throughout the late century, and the Whitechapel murders arrive perfectly suited to public obsession. They combine urban fear, sexuality, violence, class anxiety, and mystery inside one horrifying narrative. People cannot look away. You can imagine readers unfolding newspapers over breakfast while rain streaks the windows outside. Respectable families discuss the murders with fascinated disgust. Clerks gossip in offices. Factory workers argue about suspects during meal breaks. The killer becomes a kind of dark mirror reflecting Victorian anxieties back toward themselves. Fear of anonymous cities, fear of hidden depravity, fear that civilization itself may be thinner than people pretend. Police struggle desperately to control both the investigation and public panic. Crowds gather constantly around crime scenes. False confessions flood stations. Journalists interfere repeatedly. Anti-immigrant suspicion spreads through parts of the East End as residents search anxiously for explanations. No clear answer emerges, and that uncertainty becomes part of the horror. Victorian society prefers moral clarity. Criminals should appear visibly wicked. Respectable life should remain separate from danger. The Ripper murders violate those comforting assumptions. The killer moves invisibly through one of the world's largest cities despite intense attention. Gaslight suddenly feels inadequate against darkness. Men especially experience the fear physically. Many already navigate public space cautiously after dark. Now anxiety sharpens further. Footsteps behind you matter differently. Empty streets feel longer. Strange men become impossible not to notice. Even police patrols offer limited reassurance. The East End itself becomes symbolic in the public imagination, almost mythologized into a landscape of endless vice and danger. Certain journalists describe Whitechapel with exaggerated theatrical horror, portraying poverty itself as morally contagious. Yet ordinary life continues there simultaneously. Children still play in narrow streets. Market stalls still open before dawn. Families still crowd around weak fires in cramped rooms. Immigrant communities continue building lives beneath hostile public scrutiny. The murders exist inside a real neighbourhood, not merely a nightmare. Social reformers seize upon the case as evidence of deeper urban failure. How, they ask, can the richest empire in the world contain such desperation, overcrowded housing, casual labour, alcoholism, prostitution, and chronic poverty all converge visibly in Whitechapel? The Ripper becomes inseparable from the city that produced him, or perhaps merely hid him well. Queen Victoria herself follows the case with concern and frustration. She criticises police inefficiency privately and worries about broader social disorder. By now she is elderly, widowed, increasingly symbolic rather than politically dominant. The empire surrounding her still appears powerful from a distance. Closer inspection reveals strain everywhere. Labour unrest grows, Irish political tensions deepen, European rivalries sharpen, urban poverty remains stubbornly unresolved despite decades of industrial wealth. And beneath all this, ordinary people continue carrying quiet exhaustion through overcrowded streets. The Ripper murders resonate so deeply partly because they expose vulnerability already present in Victorian life. The victims are women society often overlooks until violence transforms them into headlines. Their deaths force brief attention towards people usually pushed to the edges of public concern. Then the attention fades again. The killer is never conclusively identified. Suspects emerge endlessly afterward. Doctors, butchers, sailors, aristocrats, foreigners, madmen. Conspiracy theories multiply across generations because uncertainty leaves space for imagination. But the real Whitechapel remains less dramatic than later mythology. It is mostly damp lodging houses, cold mornings, cheap gin, people trying not to fall completely through the cracks of industrial society. Late at night during those fearful autumn months, London listens differently to itself. Policemen pause beneath flickering lamps scanning empty streets. Women hurry home with shoulders tight against the cold. Newspaper presses thunder through the darkness, printing fresh speculation before dawn. And somewhere beyond the gaslight, unseen among millions of strangers, a killer moves through the exhausted city while the empire sleeps uneasily around him. The fog drifts low along Whitechapel Road. Boot steps echo briefly, then disappear. The black clothing never fully disappears after Albert dies. For years, Queen Victoria wears mourning so consistently that it becomes almost part of the architecture of the monarchy itself. Black dress, black gloves, black ribbons against pale aging skin, court ceremonies dimmed by absence. Grief settles over the later Victorian era like another kind of weather. Albert's death in 1861 devastates her beyond what many advisers initially understand. He is only 42, typhoid fever, or possibly another illness later debated by historians, carries him away after days of worsening weakness at Windsor Castle. Victoria is left emotionally shattered. You can picture the silence afterward inside the royal rooms, half-read papers resting untouched on desks, firelight moving gently across furniture still arranged for two people, servants speaking in lowered voices because sorrow itself seems to occupy the corridors. The Queen withdraws almost immediately. Public appearances become rare. Official duties continue unevenly. Critics grow frustrated by her absence while sympathisers recognise genuine devastation beneath it for long stretches. Victoria prefers isolation at Osborne House or Balmoral, surrounded by reminders of Albert carefully preserved against time. His clothes remain laid out each morning. Hot water prepared daily. Washing. A place set permanently inside routine for someone already gone. Victorian Britain understands mourning intimately, but Victoria's grief still unsettles the nation through its intensity and duration. Some subjects begin calling her the Widow of Windsor. Republican sentiment briefly grows louder as people question the purpose of an invisible monarchy, yet eventually the mourning itself becomes part of her symbolic power. Because ordinary people recognise something painfully human inside it. The empire may stretch across continents, but widows still wake, reaching instinctively toward empty space beside them in the dark. And by now Britain itself is aging into something heavier than its earlier confidence. The industrial optimism of the mid-century remains visible in engineering achievements, imperial ceremonies, scientific progress, and expanding cities, but beneath the surface, exhaustion accumulates. Social inequality persists stubbornly. Urban poverty remains impossible to ignore entirely. International rivalries sharpen across Europe. Even the weather in late Victorian memory often feels grey. Fog pressing against railway station, rain darkening stone building, winter afternoons ending before workers return home. You begin noticing how much Victorian life revolves around endurance by these later decades. Bodies enduring labour, families enduring grief, cities enduring overcrowding, the empire enduring through military force and administrative strain, and Victoria herself enduring through loneliness. At Balmoral in Scotland, she finds something close to peace occasionally. The Scottish Highlands offer distance from London ceremony and political pressure, cold air, open landscapes, deer moving silently across hills beneath drifting mist. There she walks, rides, writes letters, and clings fiercely to personal routines. Her relationships after Albert's death become subjects of endless public speculation, most famously with John Brown, a Scottish servant whose blunt manner and loyalty provide companionship during Victoria's darkest years. The closeness between them disturbs certain members of the royal household profoundly. Rumours spread naturally, some affectionate, some cruel. No clear agreement survives about the full nature of their relationship. Historians still debate emotional details obscured by the destroyed letters and royal secrecy, but loneliness itself is undeniable. Power does not protect people from needing tenderness. Meanwhile, the empire reaches its widest territorial extent during Victoria's later reign. Imperial ceremonies grow grander. Jubilees celebrate decades upon the throne with enormous public displays of loyalty and national pride. The Golden Jubilee in 1887 especially reveals how thoroughly Victoria has transformed from uncertain young queen into symbolic grandmother of empire. Crowds line London streets cheering as processions pass beneath banners and military music. Colonial representatives arrive from across the world wearing uniforms, jewels, medals, fabrics, and ceremonial dress reflecting the vastness of imperial reach. The spectacle dazzles observers, and yet the contradictions remain visible beneath the pageantry. Independence intensify. Labour unrest spreads through industrial districts. Slums still crowd the edges of wealth. Colonial violence continues overseas even during celebration. The empire shines brightest, perhaps precisely because so many anxieties surround it now. Victorian culture grows increasingly nostalgic during these years too. People begin romanticising disappearing rural traditions, older moral certainties, quieter landscapes untouched by factories and railways. Modernity exhausts people eventually. They depend upon it. Electric lighting begins, replacing gas lamps in certain districts by the late century. Telephones appear experimentally. New inventions arrive constantly. Cities glow brighter after dark than earlier generations would consider imaginable, and yet emotional loneliness persists stubbornly beneath technological change. A clerk rides crowded trains home each evening to rented rooms where nobody waits. A widow folds mourning clothes carefully into drawers after another funeral. An aging factory worker feels his joints stiffen during cold mornings, while younger men replace him gradually. Time moves faster now, perhaps too fast. Victoria herself becomes physically smaller with age, increasingly round, increasingly dependent upon attendants, yet emotionally formidable beneath the frailty. She continues ruling through ministers, reading dispatches, following imperial affairs, maintaining stubborn habits developed over decades. Foreign leaders treat her with extraordinary respect by the end of the century, not because she dominates politics personally, but because she embodies continuity itself. She has outlived revolutions, wars, political crises, and countless public figures once considered permanent. Entire generations know no other monarch. To many Britons, Victoria simply feels eternal, but the century around her is changing into something harder. Germany rises rapidly after unification. Industrial competition intensifies internationally. Military technologies grow more destructive. Social tensions deepen across Europe beneath outward stability. The 20th century waits just beyond the horizon, already sharpening its knives. Late in the evening at Osborne or Windsor, Victoria sometimes sits beside lamplight reviewing letters while servants move quietly through familiar rooms. Outside, winter rain taps softly against the windows. Somewhere a clock marks another passing hour inside a palace filled with memories. The Empire still surrounds her in maps, ceremonies, military reports, and endless correspondence. Yet grief remains closer than empire now, closer than politics, closer than triumph, and as the old queen moves slowly through the final years of her long reign, Victorian Britain begins sensing something difficult to name aloud. Not merely the approaching death of a monarch, the approaching end of an entire emotional world. Winter settles gently over Britain during the final years of Victoria's reign. Not gentle everywhere. Of course, industrial cities still wake beneath smoke-dark mornings. Dock workers still labour through freezing rain beside black water. In crowded terraces across Manchester and London, thin blankets still fail to keep out the cold completely. But the century itself feels tired now, as though the long Victorian age has been carrying too much weight for too many years, and can no longer quite straighten its back. By 1901, Queen Victoria is old, widowed, physically frail, and increasingly distant from the roaring modern world unfolding around her. She spends much of her time at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by attendants, correspondence, fading routines, and memories that have outlived almost everyone who originally shared them. The empire outside remains immense. The confidence inside it feels Lessian. You can sense the strain almost everywhere by the century's end. Britain still controls vast territories across the globe, still commands enormous naval power, still celebrates industrial achievement and imperial prestige through ceremonies bright with flags and military music. Yet beneath the pageantry sits unease. The Boer War in South Africa exposes unexpected military weakness and administrative confusion. British forces eventually prevail, but the conflict becomes longer, uglier, and more controversial than many anticipated. Reports emerge describing concentration camps where Boer civilians, especially women and children, suffer terribly from disease and inadequate conditions. Public discomfort spreads slowly. The empire no longer appears effortlessly righteous. At home, labour movements grow stronger, trade unions organise more effectively, socialist ideas circulate through working-class districts where industrial prosperity has failed to erase exhaustion and poverty. Wealth remains astonishingly unevenly distributed. The grand Victorian promise of universal progress feels incomplete now. Too many people remain hungry. Too many children still labour. Too many slums crowd beneath the shadows of wealth. And still the cities continue growing. Electric lights spread gradually through urban streets, replacing the softer uncertainty of gas lamps with harsher illumination. Motorcars begin appearing beside horse traffic. Telegraph wires crisscross the country. Cinema flickers into existence experimentally, capturing moving human images that feel almost supernatural to early audiences. Modernity accelerates again. The old rhythms struggle to keep pace. You imagine elderly Victorians watching these transformations with mixed emotions. Wonder certainly. Pride sometimes, but also disorientation. The world they were born into has vanished almost completely within a single lifetime. A person born before railways can now witness electric lighting, photography, telephones, modern anesthesia, steel warships, and moving pictures. History has moved extraordinarily fast around them, and through all of it, Victoria remained seated at the symbolic centre of national life like a dark-clothed monument to continuity. Her face appears in newspapers, coins, schoolrooms, official portraits, shop windows. For younger Britons, she has always existed. The idea of Britain without Victoria feels almost impossible to imagine. Yet inside Osborne House during January 1901, the Queen weakens visibly. Her eyesight fades. Her appetite diminishes. Family members gather quietly around her bedside while doctors move through softly lit corridors carrying worried expressions they attempt unsuccessfully to conceal. Outside, winter rain moves across the gardens. Inside, the Empire waits. Victoria drifts in and out of awareness during her final days. She asks for photographs of Albert and family members to remain nearby. Old memories seem to return more vividly than present realities. At times she speaks softly in German from childhood habit. There is something deeply human about the scene despite all the imperial symbolism surrounding it. An elderly woman growing tired. Children and grandchildren watching helplessly. The familiar fear of approaching absence settling across a family room. When Victoria dies on January 22, 1901, after nearly 64 years on the throne, Britain falls into mourning almost instinctively. Church bells toll. Newspapers print black borders. Crowds gather silently outside royal residences. Many people feel as though a piece of themselves has vanished with her. Not because Victoria was universally loved in every moment of her reign. She could be stubborn, demanding, emotionally difficult, politically conservative. Entire populations across the empire experienced her rule very differently depending upon where they stood within imperial structures. But she endured, and endurance carries emotional power. The Victorian Age officially ends with her death. Though history rarely obeys such neat boundaries, factories still operate, ships still cross imperial oceans, children still hurry through crowded streets toward exhausting jobs. Yet something intangible changes all the same. The long 19th century of steam, coal smoke, imperial certainty, domestic ritual, moral restraint, industrial optimism, and hidden loneliness finally begins loosening its grip. A newer century waits outside the door, harder in many ways, more violent too. The generation coming next will inherit technologies and political tensions capable of destruction on scales the Victorians scarcely imagined, despite all their wars and industrial upheaval. Soon Europe will march toward catastrophe beneath bright patriotic banners. Soon machine guns and trenches will consume millions. Soon the empire itself will begin fracturing under pressures already visible beneath the polished surface. But tonight those futures remain mercifully distant. For now there is only the fading winter light over Osborne House. The hush inside crowded streets after news of the Queen's death spreads. The soft sound of newspaper pages turning beside evening fires across Britain. And perhaps something else too. A quiet recognition that history never moves cleanly from darkness into progress, or from suffering into wisdom. The Victorian era builds railways, hospitals, sanitation systems, scientific breakthroughs, and extraordinary works of literature and engineering. It also builds slums, workhouses, colonial violence, factories filled with exhausted children. The age believes deeply in improvement while often failing to recognize who pays for it. And maybe that contradiction feels familiar even now. Late at night, after the century finally closes, Britain settles uneasily into sleep beneath drifting smoke and winter rain. Railway whistles echo through the darkness. Ships move slowly along black water toward distant colonies. Somewhere a tired seamstress extinguishes her lamp before dawn arrives again. Somewhere else, a child dreams beside factory-stained curtains, while the empire hums quietly beyond the walls. And overhead, invisible beneath cloud and fog, the 20th century waits patiently for morning. The fire has burned low now, and the streets of Victorian Britain are fading gently back into darkness behind us. The trains grow quieter, the gaslights dim. Rain drifts softly across empty cobblestones where footsteps once hurried beneath the long shadow of empire. You have walked through crowded factories, abundant parlours, railway stations, fog-bound alleys, palace corridors, and distant colonial harbours beside millions of ordinary people who never imagined they were living inside history. They were simply trying to endure another winter, another shift, another loss, another fragile hope for something better. And perhaps that is what lingers most strongly about the Victorian Age. Not only the power or the spectacle, but the human tiredness beneath it. The mothers holding households together quietly, the workers breathing coal smoke before sunrise, the grieving widows sitting beside fading firelight, the children watching trains cross the countryside toward futures nobody fully understood yet. History can sometimes feel distant until you notice how familiar the emotions remain. The fear of change, the longing for dignity, the need for warmth, companionship, and meaning while the world transforms around you faster than comfort allows. Thank you for spending these quiet hours here with me tonight. And if this journey through the Victorian century stayed with you in some small way, I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or which moments of history you find yourself returning to most often when the world grows still. Until our next walk into the past, may your evening feel calm, your thoughts gentle, and your rest uninterrupted.